Today is the 300th anniversary of the birth of Johnathon Edwards. After growing up in a pastor's home, Johnathon Edwards went to Yale to be educated further and became the assistant to his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, as pastor of the church in Northampton, Massachusetts. Upon Stoddard's death a couple of years later, in 1729, Johnathon became the sole pastor of that church. And under his preaching, the church there knew times that were called awakenings. In fact, along with George Whitefield, Edwards' name is usually associated with the Great Awakening that swept through the British colonies in America in the 1740s. And one of the pivotal events in that awakening was the preaching of the sermon that I intend to deliver again this morning. On Wednesday, July the 8th, 1741, Edwards went with other ministers to help the church in Enfield on the Massachusetts-Connecticut border. There he preached his famous, and I realize in some circles, infamous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He had preached it the month before in his own congregation. Preachers do that kind of thing, you know. And he would preach it again a number of times after that famous occasion at Enfield. As best we can tell, the response to Edwards' sermon was electrifying. He could not even complete the sermon. There were responses, loudly, of wails and cries. Why? Well, it wasn't because of his verbal style, which was quite staid and certainly far less dramatic than George Whitefield's. It was because of the content. It was because of what he said. In this sermon, Edwards took a text from the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 32, and he had just one point. His hearers were not in hell that very moment only because of God's grace. He meditated on the inevitability of the fall of the wicked, the suddenness of that fall, that is, that it will be unexpected, and what they fall into, hell. He talked at some length of people being held out of hell only by God's mere grace or pleasure, as Edwards put it. He assumed that motivating his hearers by fear was a legitimate way of moving people to action, so long as those things feared were true and the motivation charitable. What Edwards didn't talk about much is important for us to note: the biblical basis of the picture of hell and the good news of how sinners escape that. Isaac Watts, the great hymn writer whose hymns we enjoy here so much, was a contemporary of Edwards, and he got a printed copy of the sermon, and he penned on that a most terrible, by which he meant terrifying, sermon, which should have had a word of gospel at the end of it. Though I think 'tis all true. Both the biblical basis for hell and the gospel of Christ alluded to repeatedly in the sermon. But Edwards would have assumed among his hearers almost universal knowledge of such matters. I can't do that today. If you find this whole idea of judgment offensive, Edwards gives no apologetic in this sermon. In that day and age, it would have been assumed. This would not have been a controversial point for them. As George Marsden puts it, building on the widely held premise of New Englanders that hell was as genuinely a reality as China, Edwards hoped to awaken people to what that awful reality must mean to them here and now. He wanted his hearers not just to grasp the reality of hell with their minds, but with their hearts. And such deliberate terror, he prayed, would bring them to find joy in Christ. And we have accounts from that day at Enfield that, in fact, that is what happened in many people's lives. And if hell is real, it is a loving thing to warn people of it. You're probably not sensible of this. You find you are kept out of hell, but do not see the hand of God in it. But look at other things, as the good state of your bodily constitution, the care of your own life, the means that you use for your own preservation. But indeed, these things are nothing if God should withdraw his hand. They would avail no more to keep you from falling than the thin air to hold up a person that is suspended in it. Your wickedness makes you, as it were, as heavy as lead, and to tend downwards with great weight and pressure towards hell. And if God should let you go, you would immediately sink and swiftly descend and plunge into the bottomless gulf, and your healthy constitution, and your own care and prudence, and the best contrivance, and all your righteousness would have no more influence to uphold you and keep you out of hell than a spider's web would have to stop a falling rock. Were it not for the sovereign pleasure of God, the earth would not bear you for one moment, for you are a burden to it. The creation, it says in Romans 8, groans with you. The creature is made subject to the bondage of your corruption, not willingly. The sun does not willingly shine upon you to give you its light to serve sin and Satan. The earth does not willingly yield her increase to satisfy your lusts, nor is it willingly a stage for your wickedness to be acted upon. The air does not willingly serve you for breath to maintain the flame of life in your vitals while you spend your life in the service of God's enemies. God's creatures are good and were made for men to serve God with, and do not willingly subserve to any other purpose, and groan when they are abused to purposes so directly contrary to their nature and end. And the world would spew you out were it not for the sovereign hand of God, of him who hath subjected it in hope. There are the black clouds of God's wrath now hanging directly over your heads, full of the dreadful storm and big with thunder. And were it not for the restraining hand of God, it would immediately burst forth upon you. The sovereign pleasure of God, for the present, stays his rough wind. Otherwise, it would come with fury, and your destruction would come upon you like a whirlwind, and you would be like chaff at the summer threshing floor. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow, and it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. Thus all you that never passed under a great change of heart, by the mighty power of his Spirit of God upon your souls, all you that were never born again or made new creatures, and raised from being dead in sin to a state of new and before altogether unexperienced light and life, you are in the hands of an angry God. However, you may have reformed your life in many things, and may have had many religious affections, and may keep up a form of religion in your families and closets and in the house of God, it is nothing but the mere pleasure that keeps you from being this moment swallowed up in everlasting destruction. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like the fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him infinitely more than a stubborn rebel ever did his prince. And yet it is nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment. It is to be ascribed to nothing else that you did not go to hell last night, that you were suffered to awake again in this world after you closed your eyes to sleep. And there is no other reason to be given why you have not dropped into hell since you arose this morning, but that God's hand has held you up. There is no other reason to be given why you have not gone to hell since you sat here in the house of God, provoking his pure eyes. Yea, there is nothing else that is to be given as a reason why you do not this very moment drop down into hell. Oh, sinner, consider the fearful danger that you are in. It is a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit full of fire of wrath that you are held over in the hand of that God, whose wrath is provoked and incensed as much against you as against many of the damned in hell. You hang by a slender thread with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it, and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder. And you have no interest in any mediator. And nothing to lay hold of to save yourself. Nothing to keep off the flames of wrath. Nothing of your own. Nothing that you have ever done. Nothing that you can do to induce God to spare you one moment.